What's going on? I'm Matt from Universal Audio, and today I'm going to show you some tips and tricks for using the Minimoog synthesizer. This plugin is an authentic recreation of one of the most iconic synthesizers ever made, the Minimoog Model D. Its instantly recognizable analog sound can be heard on classic records by Parliament, Dr. Dre, Stevie Wonder, and tons of other artists. And now you can get that same sound right in your DAW. The Minimoog is one of the first synths designed to be an expressive, playable instrument, and its simple layout and pre-patched connections mean you can spend more time making music and less time messing around with complicated menus or controls. The UA version takes the playability a step further with plug-in-only features like adjustable velocity sensitivity, plus new modulation options that make this classic synth right at home in modern workflows. Let's pull up some sounds and see what the Minimoog can do. The Minimoog is a monosynth, so one of the most classic uses for it is as a bass. Let's pull up our preset browser and use the bass tag to see what kind of bass patches we have. Classic funk sounds like it could be cool. Let's pull that up and see what it sounds like. So that's a classic plucky bass sound that the Minimoog is known for. Now, so much of the Minimoog's tone and character comes from the filter section, so let's check out those controls. There's three main controls for the filter. There's cutoff frequency, which you're probably used to, and then there's filter emphasis, which more commonly is known as resonance. There's also amount of contour, which controls the amount of modulation from the filter envelope. So I'm going to play this example again and change some of these filter controls to see what other kind of sounds we can get here. Cool, so by using those three controls, I have a lot of options for shaping the sound of the Minimoog using the filter. I really like the sound when I crank down the cutoff frequency, turn up the amount of contour, and then use that decay control in the envelope to really control how quick that pluck is. So I think I can take this sound a step further by beefing it up a little bit, and the Minimoog has a really cool trick for this, which is the external input volume knob. First, I'm going to make sure the input switch is set to feedback. What this is going to do is route the output of the Minimoog back to the input of the filter. And if I crank up this external input volume knob, it's going to give me some crazy feedback. But if I use it sparingly, it's going to add some really cool harmonics and beef up the sound in a cool way. So first I'm going to switch the external input on using this blue switch. Then I'm going to play this example again and use the external input volume knob to add some dirt. Let's check it out. So you hear how he really filled out the bottom end of the sound and added some cool harmonics and make it cut through a little bit more. So for this next example, let's check out a lead sound. I have the Dre Me preset loaded, which is a really cool West Coast lead sound. Let's take a listen. So right out of the box, I can add some expression to this patch using Vibrato. Vibrato is controlled with the modulation amount knob here or with the mod wheel on your keyboard. Let's play this patch again and see what that sounds like with some vibrato. So add some nice movement to the patch. Now by default, the vibrato is coming from oscillator 3, which is in LFO mode right now. But let's say I want to use oscillator 3 as part of the sound. I can do that by turning on the oscillator 3 control switch, which is going to let the pitch of oscillator 3 be controlled by the keyboard. Then I'm going to turn the tuning up, say to 16 or 8. I'm going to change the tuning to put it in tune with the first oscillator, and then I'll turn it on with the blue switch to the right and turn the volume down a little bit. Now if I want to get my vibrato back, I can do that with the modulation mix sources down here and the LFO. So I'm going to set the modulation B source to LFO, then I'm going to set the modulation mix knob all the way to B. Now when I turn up the modulation amount knob, or when I use the mod wheel on my keyboard, it's going to use the LFO for vibrato instead of oscillator 3. Check it out. So I have a lot of different options for adding expression, whether it be through the oscillators or the LFOs. Really cool. So the Minimoog has a couple other ways to add expression to your patches. And one way to do that is to make the cutoff frequency of the filter respond to velocity. Now if you notice in the bottom panel here, there are these velocity controls. There's one for cutoff frequency, there's one for filter contour, and there's one for loudness. These knobs let you control how much velocity affects each of these parameters. So to make this super obvious, I'm going to turn the cutoff frequency knob all the way down, and then I'm going to turn the cutoff frequency velocity knob up a little ways. So you notice in my MIDI clip down here, my notes have different velocity, so that's going to affect how far the filter opens up with each note. Let's take a listen. So at lower velocities, the filter stays more closed, and at higher velocities, the filter opens up more, which gives me some really cool playable expression to the patch. So one section we haven't talked about yet is the amp envelope, which in the Minimoog is known as loudness contour. This lets us shape the final output. For example, I can turn this legato lead sound into a pluck by turning the sustain level all the way down, and then by using the decay knob to control the length of the pluck. Take a listen. So the loudness contour envelope gives me an easy way to shape the output from the Minimoog, and similarly, I can also use the filter envelope controls right above to control the shape of the filter as well. So like I mentioned, the Minimoog is a monosynth, which makes it perfect for things like basses and leads, but it's also capable of some really cool layered sounds as well. Let's take a look at how to turn the default patch into a layered chord sound that we can use for pads. So I'll do this by tuning each oscillator to a different note to build my chord. In this case, I have oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 turned on, and I want to tune oscillator 2 to a perfect fifth. Now, if you don't know what a perfect fifth is, don't worry. You can just turn the knob up and it'll become pretty obvious once you hit the right spot. So let's check that out. Cool, so now oscillator 2 is where I want it, but it's a little bit loud. So I'm gonna come in here and use the knob right next to the blue switch to turn that volume down. Now the chord should be a little more balanced. Let's take a listen. Nice, so that sounded pretty cool, but now I want to add some movement to it. It's a little bit static right now. And I'm going to do this by modulating the cutoff frequency of the filter using the LFO. So let's come down to the modulation matrix. I'm going to set the modulation B source to LFO, and I'm going to turn the modulation mix knob all the way to B. Now I'm going to turn off the oscillator modulation switch because I don't want the LFO to modulate the tuning of the oscillators. But I'm going to keep the filter modulation switch turned on, which is going to let the LFO modulate the cutoff frequency of the filter. So next, down here in the LFO section, I'm going to turn tempo sync on and I'll crank down the LFO frequency all the way to 0. Now I'm going to turn the modulation amount all the way up. And then finally, I'll turn the cutoff frequency of the filter down just a little bit to give the LFO some room to modulate it. Now let's hear what that sounds like. Now that sounded pretty close to what I want, but there's still a strong attack at the beginning of the sound, and I want to roll that off a little bit to make it a little more pad-like. So I'll come in here and turn up the attack time for the filter envelope as well as the loudness envelope, which will get rid of that hard start. Let's hear what that sounds like. So now I've turned the default patch into a layered pad sound with some really cool movement thanks to the LFO. So as we've seen, the Minimoog is more than just a synthesizer. It's a really expressive, playable instrument. And even if you're not super familiar with synthesizers, the controls are so easy, you can come in here, start tweaking knobs, and get some great sounds. There are also tons of awesome factory presets that you can start using in your projects right away, and literally everything that comes out of this thing just sounds great. Subscribe to the Universal Audio YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any future videos. I'm Matt from Universal Audio, and I'll see you next time.